friends, to another episode of JStan Studio. So it's a little bit different this time since I'm not actually doing a live stream for you guys, but I wanted to show you how I painted and finished up that painting that I was working on in the previous live stream. So I'll include a link to that somewhere so that you can actually watch the initial part of me painting live. But there's going to be a couple of time lapses and a couple of things just so that I can kind of point out and show how we finished off that painting a little bit more quickly so that there's not as much interruption or anything like that, just to kind of give you a little speed painting, so to speak. So let me minimize my video here, and we'll pull up a couple of different time lapses, basically, that I was doing. So the first one's going to be pretty quick, getting a little bit used to that software that I was using for the time lapse. So let's take a look at it. So this is where I am putting in my basic colors at the very beginning. So there's another tree line that we're adding in. So you notice that it's all gray there at the beginning there. And what's happening there is I'm just basically putting in some tree shapes. It's relatively free at that phase and loose. So I'm not too concerned with getting things, 100% perfect or worrying about painting every single leaf there. It really is a pretty free and loose piece at that point. And what I'm trying to do is, as I said in the live stream for this piece, I don't want this to be the focal point of the room that this is going into, so I'm trying to use a lot more muted shades. Instead of really bold reds, I'm mixing in a little bit of brown and a little bit of gray with the oranges and everything, just to make sure that that stuff doesn't light on fire or anything like that. So that's really kind of one of the things that I'm thinking about with that. And I want to also include in here the some of the shapes that I was using in the foreground. I'm making those being a little bit brighter, so I'm using a little bit less brown and a little bit less gray in there. And I'm using a big brush to kind of simulate the freeness of the flow of leaves and the organicness of how they grow. So that's kind of the process there with what's going on. If I continue to roll a little bit, we'll see those shapes in the foreground, and what I'm actually doing there, from what you can see, is a second layer of trees. So those colors are a little bit brighter, they're a little bit closer to the viewer, so they're a little bit more distinct as well. And then at the very end, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to fill in just sort of a coastline shape. So I'm going to be using a lot of browns and so forth, just to kind of give us a little line of where these coastal areas might be. And that's going to serve as the backdrop for where the water kind of separates, where you get the shoreline, the land from the water. So that's pretty much where we got with this section. We can do a second time lapse here, and I'll start to play that for you. So this is, as you can tell, a little bit further on. And what I'm doing here is I'm actually putting in some reflection shapes. And the way that I'm doing that is by using oil paint, actually, is what I'm using there. So I did a combination on this piece between oil and acrylic. And you can do that when you paint the acrylic and allow it to fully dry. So that's important because oils and acrylics don't mix, but acrylic paint will dry hard. It's basically kind of like a type of plastic that's used to bind the paint together. So when it's fully dry, you have another layer that you can paint on top of. And I chose to go oils on this one. And the primary reason for that is because when I'm making reflections, I really want the flowiness of the water that's kind of distorting the image to come through. So that's why I chose to go with oils. And you'll notice at one point there I took a little paper towel and I dabbed away a little bit. You can do that with oil paint pretty easily. Just take a little paper towel to lift a little bit of the paint off the canvas. And I'm doing that to kind of dull things out again. I don't want things to be super bright or super well defined because it's a reflection again. It's not, you're not looking at the tree itself, you're looking at the tree as it sort of shimmers as the water moves around it and everything. So with that, we can continue to roll it a little bit. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to sweep across with the brush. And then I will pull down and then sweep across. And what that's going to do is it's going to pull the images down, kind of distort them a little bit, and then wiping across very gently sort of smooths out any of the brush strokes that you would see that, the reflection isn't really supposed to look like that. So it kind of swoops across, gives everything sort of a similar uniform sort of appearance. And I'll go in and I'll add in a little bit of a water line later to kind of simulate the look of water in that. And right now I'm just going in and dabbing in a little bit of extra color, some browns in some spots, and I'm dabbing in some highlight colors as well, just to give it so that it's not perfectly uniform. So the trees themselves that you see are all going to have different appearances, different levels of brightness, different colors. I want to kind of capture that by putting in some browns, putting in some highlight reds and some lighter areas as well. And now what I'm doing is I'm taking my palette knife and I'm going in with some white paint, and I'm just sort of scratching in with the edge of the palette knife a water line. And basically what that serves to do is it gives the viewer two different planes, and it makes it very obvious to the viewer what's happening there. With that white line, that very fine line of white, it's suggesting to the viewer, oh, this is where the water is meeting the coastline. There's a difference here. Underneath this is the water and the reflection that we're seeing. Above this is the actual coastline and the actual trees that we're seeing. So I'm just going in with the palette knife, kind of scraping in that line there. And then as I go across, I'm just going to put in some of those similar lines throughout the water to suggest some waves. And that's a really simple way to do it, just to cut in a couple of lines. And you try to keep it parallel with the ground, because if you start getting it too off kilter, it doesn't quite look right. It looks like your earth is kind of a little bit too curved or a little bit lumpy, which is not exactly what you want when you're going for water. You want something to look flat. At this phase where I stopped the painting here is you see me putting in a couple of spots of black. And what I'm doing there is I'm putting in a couple of rocks in the water. And that's sort of a signature of mine. I really like the way that that looks, just this, still water a lot of times flowing around little rocks that are sitting on the surface of the water or anything like that. I just really like the way that that looks. So I'm making a base coat of a really dark, like black basically, color that I'm going to go on top of and add some highlights to. And as I do that, I'm also going to pull down a little bit. I'm not using oil paint there necessarily, but I'm using a similar technique as to what I did with the trees to sort of make a reflection of that rock in the water. So I'll go in, this is where I'm adding the highlights, and I go in, I'm actually not even using the knife there, I'm just using a really small liner brush to add in a little thin line of water breaking across that, breaking across the rock basically. So that's what we have there. And with that, I pretty much finish it off. I add in a couple of tiny little details, do some color corrections as I'm looking at the entire canvas. But from there, what we'll do is open up this next video, which is basically a pan across the entire piece. So this is what it looks like as it's finished. That level of glossiness that you see is going to go away as the oil paint dries. This is when it was very fresh. So this is just a pan across the piece, and that's how I completed this commission. So I really appreciate you joining in. Like I said, I'll be showing links to that original live stream that you can watch if you'd like. But again, thanks again for joining. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks.